Close your eyes and imagine standing on the banks of the Nile River 7,000 years ago. There are no pyramids piercing the horizon, no stone temples reflecting the sun, no golden death masks, no hieroglyphs carved into monument walls. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt doesn't exist yet because Egypt itself doesn't exist, not as we know it. But you're not standing in an empty wilderness. Far from it. There are people here, thousands of them. They're building villages, crafting pottery more beautiful than anything you'd find in Europe at the same time, working copper into tools and ornaments, burying their dead with elaborate care that suggests they're thinking about the afterlife. They're creating art, worshipping gods, going to war. They're doing everything that civilized people do. Except nobody remembers their names. No pharaoh claimed descent from them. No pyramid texts mention their deeds. They've been erased from history, buried under the sands of time and the overwhelming shadow of what came after. Here's the thing that blows my mind. When most people think about ancient Egypt, they picture the pyramids, the Sphinx, Tutankhamun's treasures. Maybe if they've done some reading, they go back to Nama or Menes, the legendary first pharaoh who supposedly unified Egypt around 3100 BCE. That's where the story begins, right? Wrong. That's where the story reaches its first climax, because Egyptian civilization didn't just appear fully formed in 3100 BCE like some kind of historical magic trick. Sophisticated societies don't work that way. You don't go from scattered hunter-gatherers to building pyramids in a single generation. The foundations were laid thousands of years earlier by people whose stories we're only now beginning to understand. And the craziest part? The world these prehistoric Egyptians lived in was completely, shockingly different from what we imagine. Picture this. The Sahara Desert, that vast ocean of sand stretching across North Africa, wasn't a desert at all. It was green, lush, filled with rivers and lakes and grasslands where cattle grazed and hippos wallowed and elephants roamed. That's not speculation or romantic fantasy. That's geological fact. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was an Eden, and the people living there weren't primitive savages waiting for civilization to arrive. They were sophisticated, they were innovative, and when their green world started dying, they brought their knowledge, their beliefs, their entire worldview down to the Nile Valley. If you're watching this late at night or early morning, trying to fall asleep or just started your day, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love seeing how this content connects people across time zones. Someone's having breakfast in Berlin while someone else is going to bed in Boston, and we're all traveling back through time together to meet people who've been forgotten for millennia. There's something perfect about that. So what are we going to discover on this journey? We're going back more than 10,000 years to meet the first people who settled along the Nile after the last ice age ended. We're going to explore Nabta Playa, a mysterious site in the Egyptian desert with stone circles that predate Stonehenge and suggest an astronomical knowledge that's hard to explain. We're going to meet the cattle cult, people who were so obsessed with their cows that they buried them with more care than humans and created Africa's first complex religious system around them. We'll witness the great climate catastrophe that turned the green Sahara into the desert we know today and forced tens of thousands of people to migrate to the Nile, bringing their beliefs and technologies with them. We'll meet the Badarian culture, Egypt's first farmers, whose craftwork was so refined it makes you question everything you thought you knew about primitive societies. We'll watch as villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and chiefs became kings who claimed to be gods. We're going to see how religion evolved from simple ancestor worship to the complex mythology that would eventually give us Osiris and Ra and Horus. We'll explore Hierakonpolis, the power center, where the first real pharaohs emerged, where temple complexes were built centuries before the pyramids, where the entire template for Egyptian civilization was forged, and we'll uncover the brutal unification wars that turned a collection of competing kingdoms into the single unified Egypt that would dominate the ancient world. This isn't a side story or background information. This is the main event, because without these forgotten people, without their innovations and their beliefs and their struggles, there would be no pharaohs, no pyramids, no Egyptian civilization as we know it. Everything we associate with ancient Egypt, from the gods to the art to the obsession with the afterlife, has its roots in this prehistoric period that nobody teaches you about in school. The people who built the foundations of Egyptian civilization are about to step out of the shadows. And trust me, their story's going to change everything you thought you knew. Let's go back, way back. Here's what you need to understand about the Sahara. It wasn't always a desert, not even close. 6,000 years ago, when your mental image of Egypt starts forming, pyramids, pharaohs, desert kingdoms, the Sahara Desert as we know it didn't exist yet. Where you see endless sand dunes and lifeless rock today, there were grasslands stretching to the horizon, rivers cutting through valleys, lakes so vast you couldn't see across them, herds of animals so dense they darkened the plains like living shadows. This isn't speculation. This isn't romantic fantasy about a lost paradise. This is documented geological fact, confirmed by multiple lines of evidence that all point to the same stunning conclusion. The Sahara was green, and it was full of people. Geologists call it the African humid period. It lasted roughly from 11,000 BCE to around 5,000 BCE. That's 6,000 years of abundance in what is now the largest hot desert on Earth. To put that in perspective, 6,000 years is longer than all of recorded human history. It's the entire span from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the present day. That's how long the Green Sahara lasted. What caused it? Climate science gives us the answer, and it's both simple and profound. The Earth's axis wobbles. Not dramatically, not quickly, but measurably over periods of thousands of years. This wobble changes where the planet tilts toward the sun during different seasons. Around 11,000 BCE, this wobble shifted the summer monsoons that normally stop at the edges of North Africa. Suddenly, those massive weather systems that bring life-giving rain to sub-Saharan Africa were reaching hundreds of miles further north. Rain that had been falling on the Sahel and the savannas started falling on the Sahara itself, and when it falls, everything changes. Within just a few centuries, grasslands began colonizing areas that had been barren for millennia. Rivers that had been dry gullies for thousands of years started flowing again, fed by rain falling in highlands to the south and east. Lakes formed in low-lying basins, some of them massive. Lake Chad, and what is now one of the driest regions on Earth, swelled to the size of the Caspian Sea. You could have sailed a boat from Chad to Algeria, following interconnected waterways through landscapes that are now nothing but sand and rock. The animals came next. Following the grass, following the water, they spread across the newly verdant landscape in numbers that would seem impossible today. Elephants, not the desert-adapted species, but proper savanna elephants, roamed in herds across what is now central Sahara. Giraffes stretched their necks to browse on acacia trees growing in valleys that are now dust bowls. Hippopotamuses wallowed in rivers and lakes across Libya, Algeria, and Chad. Lions hunted gazelles and antelope across plains that stretched for hundreds of miles without interruption. And everywhere there was water. Not just rivers and lakes, but wetlands, seasonal pools, springs bubbling up from underground aquifers. The archaeological evidence shows human settlements clustered around these water sources, communities that could support themselves year-round without needing to migrate constantly in search of resources. The proof is literally written on the rocks. Throughout the Sahara, in places so remote and hostile that few people ever see them, there are stone walls covered with artwork. Not crude scratches, but sophisticated engravings and paintings depicting a world that seems impossible when you're standing in 120-degree heat surrounded by nothing but sand. At Tassili Nedja in Algeria, rock shelters contain thousands of painted images showing people swimming, boats on rivers, fishermen casting nets. There are hippos, crocodiles, fish being speared in waters that disappeared 7,000 years ago. Some images show elaborate pastoral scenes with cattle being herded, suggesting not just hunting and gathering, but early animal domestication. In the Caucasus Mountains of Libya, similar artwork covers cliff faces and cave walls, elephants being hunted, giraffes grazing, human figures dancing in elaborate ceremonies. Some of the paintings show what appear to be ritual scenes, suggesting these weren't just survival camps, but communities with cultural traditions, religious practices, social structures complex enough to require symbolic expression. The Gilf Kabir Plateau in Egypt's western desert contains the famous Cave of Swimmers, paintings showing human figures in poses that clearly represent swimming, surrounded by images of water animals. Standing in that cave today, with nothing but barren rock and sand for hundreds of miles in every direction, the paintings feel like messages from another planet. But the most important site isn't famous for its art. It's famous for what it reveals about human sophistication during the Green Sahara period. Nabta Playa, Located about 700 miles south of Cairo in what is now one of the most inhospitable parts of the Egyptian desert, was once the shore of a seasonal lake. When rains came, the playa would fill with water, creating a shallow lake that could sustain communities for months at a time. When the rains failed, it would dry up, forcing inhabitants to move to more reliable water sources. Around 7,500 BCE, people started coming back to Nabta Playa regularly, not just camping randomly, but building structures, stone circles, alignments of megaliths. What might be the world's oldest astronomical alignment, markers positioned to track the summer solstice. We'll explore Nabta Playa in detail later, but for now, understand this. These weren't desperate refugees scratching out survival in a harsh environment. These were people who had the resources, the time, and the cognitive sophistication to build monuments, to track celestial movements, to create something permanent in a landscape that was anything but permanent. The environmental data supports what the archaeology suggests. Sediment cores drilled from old lake beds showed layers of organic material, pollen from grasses and trees, even microscopic algae indicating freshwater ecosystems. These weren't occasional puddles appearing after rare rainstorms. These were stable, long-lasting bodies of water supporting complex food webs. Animal bones from archaeological sites show the full range of African megafauna, not just small game like gazelles and rabbits, but elephants, buffalo, even extinct species like the giant buffalo that stood 6 feet at the shoulder. The hunters of the Green Sahara were taking down massive animals, which means they had sophisticated weapons, coordinated hunting strategies, and social organization capable of distributing meat from kills that could yield thousands of pounds of food. Most tellingly, there's evidence of early pastoralism. Some communities weren't just hunting wild animals, they were keeping cattle, domesticated cattle, herded and managed, appearing in rock art and confirmed by bone evidence at archaeological sites. This represents a massive cognitive and social leap. You can't just decide to keep cattle one day. You need generational knowledge about animal behavior, breeding, disease management. You need social agreements about who owns which animals, how they're managed, how they're distributed. The Green Sahara wasn't just habitable. It was a crucible of human innovation. Think about daily life for these people. You wake up in a shelter made of wood and reeds, materials that are absolutely unavailable in the modern Sahara. The air is warm but not scorching, cooled by moisture from the nearby lake. You can hear birds, thousands of them, nesting in the wetlands. As you walk to the water's edge, you pass grazing antelope that barely notice your presence, because game is so abundant that hunting pressure hasn't made them skittish. You spend the morning fishing, using barbed harpoons carved from bone. The catch is good, as it usually is. By midday, you've caught enough fish to feed your extended family group of 20 people, with plenty left over to dry for later. In the afternoon, some of the group heads out to check on the cattle, making sure they haven't wandered too far from the settlement. Others work on tools, crafting new spear points from stone nodules collected from a quarry 2 days' walk away. In the evening, as the sun sets over the lake, your group gathers around a fire. Stories are told, knowledge passed down. The elder explains how to read the stars, how to know when the rains will come and when they'll fail. Children practice throwing spears at targets, learning skills they'll need as hunters. Someone paints images on the rock wall of the shelter, adding to the layers of artwork that document generations of occupation. This was life in the Green Sahara. Not perfect, not without challenges, but abundant enough that human communities could grow, develop culture, innovate. For 6,000 years, this world persisted. Multiple human lifetimes, hundreds of generations who knew nothing but this green, living landscape. But here's what makes this story essential to understanding prehistoric Egypt. These people, these Green Sahara communities, they didn't just disappear when the climate changed. They went somewhere, and that somewhere was the Nile Valley. Around 5000 BCE, the wobble that had brought the monsoons north began reversing. Year by year, the rains became less reliable, lakes started shrinking, rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal. Grasslands retreated, replaced by scrub, then by bare rock and sand. The animals moved south, following the rain and the grass back toward the Sahel, and the people followed. Or rather, most of them did. But some looked east, toward the one place where water was still reliable, where the promise of permanent settlement beckoned. They looked toward the Nile. These were primitive refugees fleeing disaster. These were sophisticated communities with generations of accumulated knowledge about animal management, stone tool technology, astronomical observation, and social organization. They were people who had built monuments in the desert, people who had created art that would last for millennia, people who understood how to manage resources and maintain cultural traditions across generations. When they reached the Nile Valley, they brought all of that with them, every skill, every tradition, every piece of hard-won survival knowledge from their lost green world. They brought the seeds of civilization itself, planted in a desert paradise that was already dying. The Green Sahara was ending, but its people, its cultures, its accumulated wisdom was about to transform the Nile Valley into something unprecedented, something that would eventually build pyramids and create pharaohs and establish one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. But first, they had to survive the journey, and they had to learn to live in a completely different world. Before there was Egypt, before there were pharaohs, before anyone had thought to stack one stone on top of another, to build something permanent, there were people living along the Nile, not for centuries, not for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years. The oldest evidence of human presence along the Nile dates back over 400,000 years. Stop and think about that for a second. 400,000 years. That's not just before the pyramids. That's before modern humans even existed. These were our evolutionary cousins, probably Homo heidelbergensis, the species that would eventually give rise to both Neanderthals and modern humans. They were already there, already living along the river, already figuring out how to survive in a landscape we wouldn't recognize. Because here's what almost nobody realizes. The Nile, the Nile from the history books, the steady, predictable river that flooded every summer and made Egyptian civilization possible, that Nile is very, very young. For most of human history, the Nile wasn't one river. It was a series of disconnected lakes. Then it was a raging torrent. Then it disappeared completely. Then it came back as something else entirely. The river changed personalities more often than it stayed the same, and the humans living along its banks had to adapt or die. The earliest stone tools found along the Nile are simple: hand axes, choppers, basic cutting implements, the kind of tools that have been made for over 1 million years by various human species across Africa. But even these simple tools tell us something important. They're there, consistently. Archaeological sites dot the ancient river terraces, the raised banks that show where the river used to flow during different climate periods. Wherever the river went, humans followed. When the climate changed and the river shifted its course, they moved with it. Then, around 150,000 years ago, something changed. The archaeological record shows the appearance of what's called the Assyrian culture. Named after a site in Algeria, the Assyrian people created a distinctive type of stone tool, projectile points with a stem at the base for hafting onto spears or arrows. These weren't just rocks chipped into shape. These were precision instruments, carefully crafted for a specific purpose, hunting at a distance. The Assyrian people spread across North Africa during one of the periodic wet phases when the Sahara turned green. They followed the rivers and lakes that appeared during these climate windows, and some of them made it to the Nile Valley. We find their distinctive tools scattered along ancient shorelines, sometimes in places that are now hundreds of feet above the modern river level. Evidence that the Nile has risen and fallen, carved deeper and shallower channels, dramatically changed its character over and over again. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Assyrian culture disappeared around 40,000 years ago, probably wiped out by one of the periodic droughts that turned the Sahara back into desert. But the people along the Nile survived. They always survived. Because no matter how bad the drought got, the Nile kept flowing. It might become smaller, more seasonal, but it never completely dried up. As long as there was rain falling somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands or the Central African lakes, there would be water flowing north through Egypt. The populations that made it through these climate disasters developed something remarkable, an almost obsessive knowledge of the river's behavior. They had to. Their survival depended on understanding when and where the water would rise, when and where fish would spawn, when and where migratory animals would cross. This wasn't casual knowledge. This was survival information, passed down generation after generation, refined over thousands of years until it became a kind of science. By 25,000 years ago, we start seeing archaeological cultures that are distinctly Nilotic. Not just people who happen to live near the river, but people whose entire way of life was built around it. The Komombo culture, named after sites in Upper Egypt, shows evidence of sophisticated fishing technology. Not just hand lines and simple traps, but composite hooks made from multiple pieces of bone, weighted nets, probably even fish weirs, permanent structures built in the river to channel fish into killing zones. They were also making some of the earliest known pottery in the world. Crude stuff compared to what would come later, but revolutionary at the time. Clay vessels meant they could store food, boil water, process plants that would have been inedible raw. It was a fundamental expansion of the human food supply, and it was happening along the Nile thousands of years before it appeared in most other places. Then came the Halfan culture around 18,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age. Now, Egypt wasn't covered in glaciers, but the ice age still affected it dramatically. With so much water locked up in ice sheets covering Europe and North America, sea levels dropped over 300 feet. The Nile, suddenly flowing to a Mediterranean that was much farther away, carved a deep, narrow gorge. The river became faster, more dangerous, harder to access. The Halfan people adapted by becoming incredibly mobile. Archaeological evidence shows they moved seasonally, following game animals and fish populations up and down the river. Their stone tools are beautiful, tiny geometric microliths that could be combined into composite tools. A single spear might have a shaft of wood with a dozen tiny stone blades set into grooves, creating a cutting edge sharper than anything we can make with metal today. These weren't primitive people. These were master craftspeople, with technologies perfectly adapted to their environment. What's remarkable is the continuity. Despite the dramatic climate changes, despite the river constantly shifting its behavior, despite periodic population crashes that must have occurred during the worst droughts, certain tool-making traditions persisted for tens of thousands of years. The same basic techniques for shaping stone, the same approaches to hafting and binding, the same solutions to common problems. This suggests unbroken chains of knowledge transmission stretching back into deep time. Picture a Halfan craftsperson, 18,000 years ago, teaching their child how to shape a piece of flint into a microlith. That child grows up and teaches the technique to their own children. Generation after generation, the knowledge flows forward, probably changing slowly, incorporating innovations, but maintaining its essential character. That craftsperson's techniques might trace back in an unbroken line to ancestors who lived 50,000, 100,000, maybe 200,000 years earlier. Knowledge pathways older than entire civilizations, maintained by oral tradition and practical demonstration. But the Halfan people were also developing something else, something that would prove even more important. They were learning to manage wild plant resources. Archaeological sites from this period show extensive processing of wild grains, grasses that grew along the riverbanks during the brief seasons when water was abundant. They were harvesting these grains systematically, probably storing them, definitely processing them with grinding stones to make flour. This wasn't agriculture yet. They weren't planting seeds or tending crops, but they were moving in that direction, developing the knowledge and techniques that would eventually make farming possible. They were learning which plants were edible, which were nutritious, how to process them efficiently. They were creating a mental database of botanical knowledge that would be passed down for thousands of years until it eventually enabled the agricultural revolution. And they were doing this while dealing with a river that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The end of the Ice Age, starting around 15,000 years ago, brought dramatic changes. As the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose. The Mediterranean crept closer to Egypt. The Nile's deep gorge began to fill with sediment. The river slowed, widened, began to flood more regularly. The seasonal inundation that would later become so important to Egyptian civilization was just beginning to establish itself. The people living along the river had to adapt to these changes in real time. Fishing strategies that had worked for thousands of years suddenly became less effective as fish populations shifted. Hunting grounds that had been reliable became swamps. Settlements that had been safe from flooding suddenly needed to be relocated to higher ground. But they adapted. They always adapted. Because that's what their ancestors had been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. By 10,000 years ago, as the climate continued to warm and the Sahara entered one of its periodic green phases, the Nile Valley was supporting substantial human populations. Not cities, not even large villages, but networks of semi-permanent camps, probably occupied seasonally, connected by kinship and trade relationships. These people were still hunter-gatherers, But they were sophisticated, specialized masters of their environment. They couldn't have known they were living in a transition period. They couldn't have known that within a few thousand years, everything about human life along the Nile would change, that farming would replace foraging, permanent villages would replace seasonal camps, chiefs would replace egalitarian bands, that the old ways, the ways their ancestors had followed for hundreds of thousands of years, would largely disappear. But here's the thing, those old ways didn't disappear completely. The deep knowledge of the river, the understanding of seasonal patterns, the fishing and hunting techniques, even some of the religious concepts, they persisted. They were transformed, incorporated into new cultural systems, but never entirely lost. When the first farmers appeared in the Nile Valley, they brought their knowledge with them. But they also learned from the people who were already there, the descendants of hunters who had lived along the river since before anyone could remember. And that exchange, that meeting between old and new, between the ancient riverine cultures and the incoming agricultural peoples, that's where our story really begins to accelerate. Because climate change was about to force another transformation, one that would drive these hunters and farmers together, compress them into an increasingly narrow band along the river, and set the stage for everything that would come after. The Sahara was about to die again, and this time, when people fled to the Nile, they would bring with them something revolutionary: cattle. Now, most people have never heard of Nabta Playa. If you ask someone to name ancient stone circles, they'll say Stonehenge. Maybe Avebury if they're feeling sophisticated. Nobody mentions Nabta Playa, which is absolutely insane, because Nabta Playa is older than Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years, possibly more, and it's sitting in the middle of the Egyptian Sahara, built by people who weren't supposed to have the organizational capacity, the astronomical knowledge, or the religious complexity to create something like this. But they did it anyway, and what they built there tells us something profound about who these people were and what they believed. Picture this. Around 6000 BCE, maybe earlier, groups of pastoralists are gathering at a seasonal lake in what's now the most desolate part of the Sahara Desert. The lake fills during summer monsoons, creating a temporary oasis surrounded by grasslands. Animals come to drink, people come to trade, share knowledge, conduct rituals. It's a meeting place, neutral ground where different groups can interact without territorial conflict. Then someone has an idea, or maybe it's a vision, a divine instruction, we'll never know. But they decide to mark this place permanently, to create something that will outlast the seasonal rains, that will stand as a statement of shared identity and shared purpose. So they start moving rocks, not small rocks either, megalithic slabs weighing hundreds of pounds, dragged from wherever they could find suitable stone in a landscape that's mostly sand and silt. They arrange these stones in a circle roughly 13 feet across, carefully positioned, deliberately aligned. When archaeologists first discovered this circle in the 1990s, they thought it might be random. Natural rock formations sometimes look intentional, but then they started measuring the alignments, and everything changed. The stones line up with the cardinal directions with remarkable precision: north, south, east, west, marked by specific megaliths. But more incredibly, certain sight lines track the summer solstice sunrise, stand in the right position on the longest day of the year, and the sun rises directly over specific stones. This wasn't accident. This was design. These people were tracking celestial movements with enough precision to create permanent markers that would work year after year, generation after generation. Think about what this means. To align stones with the summer solstice, you need to observe the sun's rising position over multiple years. You need to understand that the sunrise point changes throughout the year, moving along the horizon in a predictable pattern. You need to identify the exact day when the sun reaches its northernmost rising point. Then you need to mark that position with stones heavy enough that they won't shift. And you need to convince a bunch of other people that this project is worth the enormous labor investment. This isn't simple survival thinking. This is abstract reasoning, long-term planning, and complex social coordination. These people weren't just reacting to their environment anymore. They were trying to understand it, map it, maybe even predict it. But the stone circle was just the beginning. As archaeologists kept digging, they found something even stranger. Buried beneath carefully arranged stone structures, they discovered cattle. Not butchered for meat, not killed by disease. Deliberately buried in sculpted stone chambers, positioned carefully, sometimes with the skeleton completely articulated as if the animal had been laid to rest with reverence. One burial stands out. A cow, probably a bull based on the bone structure, placed in a clay-lined chamber covered with a megalithic slab. The skeleton was intact, suggesting the animal had been buried soon after death or possibly even alive. Around it, the excavators found pottery sherds, ostrich eggshell fragments, evidence of ritual activity. This wasn't food storage, this was religion. Now, cattle burials might not sound impressive to modern ears, but this is possibly the earliest evidence of domesticated cattle in Africa, and definitely the earliest evidence of cattle being treated as sacred beings worthy of formal burial. These people weren't just herding cattle for meat and milk. They had developed a relationship with these animals that went far beyond the practical. The cattle had become central to their identity, their worldview, their connection to the divine. Some archaeologists think the stone circle functioned as a calendar, helping the Nabta Playa people predict when the rains would come. The summer solstice alignment might mark the beginning of the monsoon season, telling pastoralists when to gather at the lake, when to expect good grazing, when to plan their seasonal movements. If you're dependent on unpredictable rains in a marginal environment, the ability to predict seasonal changes even a few weeks in advance represents a massive survival advantage. But others argue the site had deeper significance. The cattle burials suggest ritual activity that went beyond practical calendar keeping. There's evidence of feasting, of large gatherings, of communal activities that brought together groups from across the region. Maybe Nabta Playa was a pilgrimage site, a sacred center where different pastoralist groups came together to perform rituals, reaffirm social bonds, trade cattle and goods, arrange marriages between clans. The megalithic structures support this interpretation. Over several centuries, the people at Nabta Playa kept building. They erected standing stones, created stone alignments extending for hundreds of feet, constructed underground chambers lined with megalithic slabs. Some of these structures clearly have astronomical alignments. Others seem to mark directions, possibly pointing toward distant territories or water sources. Still others have no obvious practical function, suggesting they were purely symbolic or religious. One structure particularly fascinated researchers: a series of stone slabs arranged to form what looks like a complex calendar circle, with specific stones marking not just the solstices, but possibly other celestial events. Hierakonpolis stars that never set below the horizon in the northern sky, the belt stars of Orion, maybe even the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose annual reappearance the ancient Egyptians would later use to predict the Nile floods. If the Nabta Playa people were tracking Sirius 3,000 years before the pyramids, that's evidence of astronomical sophistication rivaling anything in the ancient world. But it's controversial. Some archaeologists think the alignments are too ambiguous, that we're seeing patterns that might not be intentional. The problem is we're trying to reconstruct the knowledge systems of people who left no written records, who disappeared thousands of years ago. We have stones and bones and pottery, but we don't have their stories, their myths, their explanations for why they built what they built. What we do know is that the cattle cult at Nabta Playa wasn't isolated. It was part of a wider pattern of cattle veneration that spread across the Green Sahara during this period. Rock art from across North Africa shows elaborate cattle imagery: massive herds, ceremonial scenes, cattle with decorated horns suggesting ritual significance. These weren't just economic resources, they were spiritual beings, intermediaries between humans and whatever forces these people believed controlled rain, grass, fertility. And here's where it gets really interesting. Fast forward 2,000 years. The climate crisis has forced the Saharan pastoralists to abandon places like Nabta Playa and migrate to the Nile Valley. They bring their cattle with them, they bring their beliefs with them, and when Egyptian civilization finally coalesces around 3,100 BCE, one of its most important deities is Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and motherhood. Hathor is depicted as a cow, or as a woman with cow horns and a sun disk. Her cult centers practice ritual cattle sacrifice. Her priests wear cattle hides during ceremonies. The connection might seem speculative, but the geographical and chronological links are compelling. The people who built Nabta Playa had to go somewhere when the Sahara dried up. Many archaeologists think they became the ancestors of the pre-dynastic Egyptians, bringing their astronomical knowledge, their megalithic building traditions, and their cattle cult into the Nile Valley. When Hathor appears fully formed in early Egyptian religion, she's not a new invention. She's the continuation of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, to seasonal gatherings at a now-forgotten lake in the Sahara. The social organization required to build Nabta Playa tells us something else important. These weren't simple nomadic bands living hand to mouth. They had developed the ability to mobilize labor for non-survival projects. Moving megalithic stones requires coordination, multiple people working together, agreeing on goals, following some kind of leadership structure. Someone had to have the authority to say, quote, zero, and enough people had to agree that the project was worth the effort. This suggests the Nabta Playa gatherings brought together different clan groups who recognized some form of shared authority, maybe ritual specialists who understood the astronomical alignments, maybe chiefs who could negotiate between groups and organize communal labor, maybe religious leaders who claimed divine instruction. Whatever the structure, it worked. The site was used and expanded over at least 1,500 years, possibly much longer. Then, around 4,500 BCE, it ends. The megaliths stop being erected. The cattle burials cease. The seasonal gatherings peter out. The lake at Nabta Playa dries up for the last time as the Sahara undergoes its final transformation from savanna to desert. The people scatter, following the rains, chasing the grasslands as they retreat south and east. But they took their knowledge with them. The astronomical observations, the megalithic construction techniques, the cattle cult, the tradition of communal gathering for ritual purposes, the idea that sacred places should be marked with permanent stone monuments aligned to celestial events. When the pyramids rise on the Giza Plateau 2,000 years later, aligned with incredible precision to the cardinal directions and incorporating astronomical symbolism throughout their design, they're not emerging from nothing. They're the culmination of traditions that stretch back through the pre-dynastic cultures, back through the Neolithic settlements, all the way back to the stone circles at Nabta Playa. The forgotten people of the Green Sahara weren't primitive nomads stumbling toward civilization. They were sophisticated astronomers, organized societies with complex religious beliefs, innovators who created Africa's first megalithic architecture. They just had the bad luck to build their monuments in a place that would become the world's largest desert, ensuring that their achievements would be buried under sand and forgotten for 6,000 years. But the stones remember. And now, finally, so do we. For thousands of years, the Sahara had been a paradise. Cattle herders at Nabta Playa watched their animals grow fat on endless grasslands. Fishermen pulled catfish from lakes that stretched to the horizon. Children played in forests where acacia trees provided shade from the sun. Generation after generation lived well, so well that they probably thought it would last forever. They were wrong. Around 5,500 BCE, the climate started changing. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that would trigger immediate panic. Just subtle shifts that might take a lifetime to notice. Lakes that used to flood reliably every year started having occasional dry seasons. Grasslands that had always been lush started showing patches of bare soil. Game animals that had been abundant became slightly less common. The old people probably noticed first. They remembered when the rains came earlier, lasted longer, fell harder. But who listens to old people complaining about the weather? Every generation thinks the previous one exaggerates how good things used to be. Except this time, they weren't exaggerating. The world really was dying. The mechanism behind the disaster was orbital. Earth's axis wobbles slightly over thousands of years, changing the planet's orientation to the sun. This wobble affects where and when solar radiation hits the surface, which in turn affects atmospheric circulation patterns. Around 8,000 BCE, this wobble had positioned North Africa perfectly to receive moisture from the African monsoon. Warm, wet air from the Indian Ocean swept across the continent, bringing the rains that created the Green Sahara. But by 5,500 BCE, the wobble had shifted. The monsoon's reach contracted southward. Less moisture reached the Sahara, and once the drying started, it triggered feedback loops that accelerated everything. Plants died, exposing bare soil. Bare soil reflected more sunlight than vegetation, heating the surface. Hot surfaces created rising air currents that deflected what little rain remained. Less rain meant less vegetation, which meant more bare soil, more heating, less rain. A death spiral that nothing could stop. The people living through it watched their world transform with agonizing slowness. A lake that had provided fish for 100 generations dried up over 3 or 4 decades. Children who had played in water their parents remembered became adults who stared at cracked mud. Then came a generation who only knew the lake from stories. Then stories became legends. Then even the legends were forgotten, and only the empty basin remained as evidence that water had ever existed there at all. Archaeological sites from this period tell the story through absence. At Nabta Playa, the cattle cult that had thrived for 2,000 years shows signs of stress around 5,500 BCE. Fewer animal bones and trash heaps, tool types shifting from hunting implements to more desperate technologies for extracting every possible calorie from declining resources. Then around 5000 BCE, the stone circles and megalithic structures simply stopped being built. Not because the builders had lost their ambition or forgotten their skills, because they were gone. They didn't all leave at once. This wasn't a panicked exodus. It was a slow hemorrhaging of population as conditions became gradually more unbearable. First the young would leave, seeking better territories, then families. Eventually only the most stubborn remained, the ones who couldn't imagine abandoning the land where their ancestors had lived for generations. But eventually even they had to face reality, stay and die, or leave, and maybe survive. And when they left, when thousands of years of Saharan peoples began moving, there was only one place to go, east, toward the Nile. Think about what this migration meant. The Sahara had been inhabited by countless different groups, each with their own traditions, technologies, and ways of seeing the world. Cattle herders from Nabta Playa who had developed astronomical knowledge and megalithic architecture. Hunter-gatherers from scattered oases who had refined desert survival to an art form. Fishing communities from the lakes who had their own unique tool traditions. People from what is now Libya, Chad, Sudan, all converging on the same narrow strip of territory. The Nile Valley. The Nile was the last refuge because it was the only water source that didn't depend on the rain. Its floods came from far to the south, from the Ethiopian highlands where the monsoon still brought moisture. Every year, like clockwork, the river rose, flooded its banks, deposited rich silt, then receded, leaving behind perfect conditions for cultivation. While the rest of North Africa turned to dust, the Nile remained reliable, predictable, life-giving. But the Nile Valley in 5500 BCE wasn't empty. It had its own populations who had been there for thousands of years. Native Nile dwellers who had their own ways of doing things, their own claims to territory, their own ideas about how resources should be shared. When the climate refugees started arriving, it created exactly the kind of situation that can either lead to violent conflict or unprecedented cooperation. Sometimes it was violent. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of traumatic injuries, fortified settlements, sudden abandonments. Competition for prime agricultural land along the river must have been intense. Some groups probably fought each other for access to the best floodplains. Some were displaced by stronger newcomers. Some just couldn't adapt and died out. But mostly, somehow, they figured out how to live together. The archaeological evidence shows something remarkable happening around 5000 BCE. Instead of one culture dominating and erasing all the others, we see a blending, a synthesis. Tool traditions from different regions start appearing together in the same sites. Pottery styles merge. Burial practices combine elements from multiple traditions. It's like watching ingredients from different recipes getting mixed together to create something entirely new. The herders brought their cattle and their knowledge of animal husbandry. The Nile natives contributed their understanding of flood cycle agriculture. Desert hunters shared their technologies for making specialized tools. Fishermen added their expertise in exploiting aquatic resources. Each group contributed something to the mix. More importantly, they brought their ideas, their religious concepts, their social structures, their stories about how the world worked. Some of these ideas competed, creating tensions that would echo through Egyptian history. But many merged, creating the complex religious and cultural system that would eventually become the foundation of pharaonic civilization. Think about the major themes of later Egyptian religion. The importance of cattle, clearly derived from Saharan pastoral traditions. The cosmic significance of the Nile flood, contributed by native river peoples. The solar focus of Egyptian theology, possibly reflecting the desperate sky-watching of climate refugees trying to understand what had gone wrong with their world. Even the Egyptian concept of duality, the constant balance between order and chaos, might reflect the experience of these converging populations trying to create stability from disaster. The archaeological evidence for this population influx shows up in multiple ways. Starting around 5000 BCE, there's a dramatic increase in the number and size of settlements in the Nile Valley. Sites that had been small camps become permanent villages. New areas that had been largely unoccupied suddenly show intensive habitation. The pottery record explodes with diversity as different traditions interact and influence each other. Genetic evidence, though limited, supports the picture of a major population mixing event. Modern Egyptian populations show ancestry from multiple sources, suggesting that the people living in the Nile Valley today are descended from a blend of different groups who came together during this period. The genetic diversity increased rather than decreased, the signature of migration and admixture rather than isolation. But perhaps the most telling evidence is linguistic. Ancient Egyptian, the language of the Pharaohs, shows influences from multiple language families. It's not a pure descendant of any one prehistoric language, but appears to be a contact language, one that emerged from the interaction of multiple linguistic traditions. This is exactly what you'd expect from a population formed by climate refugees from diverse origins. By 4500 BCE, the transformation was largely complete. The Sahara had become the desert we know today. The last holdouts had abandoned the final drying oases, and the Nile Valley had become one of the most densely populated regions on Earth, packed with people who had nowhere else to go. This compression, this forcing together of diverse populations into a narrow strip of territory, created exactly the conditions necessary for civilization to emerge. High population density meant specialists could emerge, people who didn't have to spend all their time producing food. Diverse cultural traditions meant a rich pool of ideas and technologies to draw from. And the absolute necessity of cooperation, of managing irrigation systems and coordinating flood cycle agriculture, meant developing social structures capable of organizing large numbers of people. The climate refugees who flooded into the Nile Valley around 5000 BCE weren't thinking about building pyramids or creating a kingdom that would last 3000 years. They were just trying to survive, looking for water and land and a future for their children. But in the process, in the desperate mixing of peoples and ideas that resulted from climate catastrophe, they created something unprecedented. They created the cultural foundation that would eventually become ancient Egypt. But first, those diverse peoples needed to figure out how to actually live together in this new, crowded environment. They needed to develop new technologies, new social structures, new ways of organizing themselves, and the first culture to really figure it out, the first to show what Nile Valley civilization could become, emerged in Upper Egypt around 4400 BCE. They were called the Badarians, and they were about to change everything. So the climate catastrophe had driven everyone to the Nile, those scattered groups from the dying Sahara, converging on the river valley like refugees fleeing a slow-motion apocalypse. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just survive. They didn't just huddle along the riverbanks waiting for things to get better. They transformed. They created something entirely new. Around 4400 BCE, maybe a bit earlier, a culture emerged in Upper Egypt that archaeologists call the Badarian, named after the site of El Badari where their remains were first discovered in 1923. And these people, these descendants of climate refugees, they were doing something nobody in the Nile Valley had done before. They were becoming farmers. But let's be clear about what that means. This wasn't some sudden agricultural revolution, where everyone woke up one morning and decided to plant crops. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming took generations, maybe centuries. Some groups probably tried it and failed. Others succeeded for a while, then gave up when the floods came wrong, or the harvest failed. The archaeological record shows this messy, complicated process. Sites with mixed economies, people who were farming but also still hunting, still gathering wild plants, still hedging their bets against disaster. The Badarians were cultivating emmer wheat and barley, two grains that would become the foundation of Egyptian civilization. But they were also hunting gazelle, fishing the Nile, collecting wild grasses and fruits. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats, animals their ancestors had probably started domesticating back when the Sahara was still green. They hadn't abandoned the old ways entirely. They were adding new strategies to their survival toolkit. And this makes sense when you think about it. Agriculture is risky, incredibly risky. You plant crops and you're betting everything on the flood coming at the right time, the right height. Too low and your fields stay dry. Too high and your seeds wash away. You're vulnerable to pests, diseases, droughts. A hunter-gatherer who has a bad day just moves to a new location. A farmer who has a bad year watches their family starve. So the Badarians kept their options open. They farmed when conditions were good. They hunted and gathered when farming failed. But gradually, year by year, farming became more reliable. Maybe they were learning to predict the floods better. Maybe they were developing irrigation techniques, simple channels to direct water to their fields. The archaeological evidence shows their settlements becoming more permanent, more substantial. These weren't temporary camps anymore. These were villages, home. And we know they were villages because of what they left behind. Mostly we know them from their dead. The Badarians buried their people with extraordinary care, not just dumping bodies in pits, but creating proper graves, oval pits lined with reed mats. Bodies placed on their left side, head facing south, looking west toward the setting sun, curled in fetal position, as if sleeping, as if waiting to be reborn. This isn't random. This is ritual. This is belief. And what they buried with their dead tells us even more. Pottery. Always pottery. Sometimes dozens of vessels in a single grave. Bowls, cups, jars, each one carefully crafted, each one placed deliberately around the body. And this Badarian pottery, it's something special. Some archaeologists think it's the finest pottery ever produced in ancient Egypt, better than anything that came later, better than the elaborate vessels of the Pharaohs. They made it from Nile silt, the same mud that flooded the valley every year. But they didn't just shape it and fire it. They burnished it, rubbing the surface with smooth stones until it gleamed like metal. Then they fired it in ways that created distinctive rippled patterns on the upper portions, combed surfaces that caught the light. The best pieces have this incredible red and black finish, red from the iron-rich clay, black from being inverted during firing so smoke penetrated the surface. This is craft. This is art. This is people who cared deeply about making beautiful things. But why? Why spend days creating a perfect vessel just to bury it with a corpse? Because they believed the dead needed these things. Wherever the dead were going, they would need containers for food and water. They would need the same things they needed in life. Other grave goods support this. Cosmetic palettes for grinding malachite into eye paint, ivory combs and bracelets, beads made from shell, stone, and bone. The women especially were buried with elaborate jewelry, strings of beads, thousands of them in some graves, belts made from shells, amulets carved into animal shapes. And here's where it gets really interesting. Those shells, they're not local. They're from the Red Sea, hundreds of miles away. The copper implements that show up in some graves, that copper's not from Upper Egypt either. It had to come from Sinai, or perhaps the Eastern Desert, from mines that required specialized knowledge to exploit. Some graves contain turquoise, lapis lazuli, materials from even farther away. This means trade networks, extensive ones. The Badarians weren't isolated villages living self-sufficient lives. They were connected to a vast web of exchange that stretched across hundreds of miles. Materials moving from the Red Sea coast to the Nile Valley. Finished goods, probably, traveling back. Maybe pottery, maybe textiles that haven't survived. Maybe food surpluses from successful harvests. And this trade required social organization. Somebody had to negotiate these exchanges. Somebody had to maintain relationships with distant communities. Somebody had to organize the expeditions to the desert mines. This suggests leadership. Not kings, not pharaohs, but individuals with enough authority and respect to coordinate these complex activities. But were the Badarians developing real social hierarchy? Were some people becoming more powerful than others? The grave evidence is mixed. Most burials are relatively similar. Everyone gets pottery. Everyone gets some grave goods. There aren't yet the massive tombs with huge amounts of wealth that we see in later periods. But there are differences. Some graves have more goods than others. Some have more exotic materials. Some have copper tools while others don't. Maybe this reflects individual wealth. Maybe some families were more successful at farming, accumulating surpluses they could trade for luxury goods. Or maybe it reflects age and respect. The graves with the most goods might belong to elders, people who had lived long lives and earned the community's admiration. Or maybe it reflects skill. The best craftspeople, the most successful traders, receiving extra honors in death. We can't know for certain. But what's clear is that Badarian society was becoming more complex. These weren't egalitarian bands where everyone was equal anymore, but they also weren't the stratified hierarchical societies that would emerge later. They were somewhere in between, transitioning, evolving. Their villages reflect this too. Badarian settlements were small, probably 100 to 200 people each, maybe less, just a few dozen families. The houses were simple, oval structures made from wooden posts and reed mats, with floors dug slightly into the ground for insulation. Not permanent stone buildings, but not temporary shelters either. These were homes meant to last years, maybe generations. The villages were positioned on the desert edge, above the floodplain. Smart positioning. Close enough to the river to access water and farmland, high enough to avoid the annual inundation. They would have watched the flood arrive each year, watched the water spread across the valley, then recede, leaving fresh silt. Then they planted. Then they waited. Then they harvested. And with each successful cycle, agriculture became more deeply embedded in their lives. But they were also maintaining the old ways. Storage pits at Badarian sites contained the bones of wild animals, gazelle mainly, but also hartebeest, hippopotamus, crocodile. They were still hunting, still supplementing their diet with wild resources. Fishing gear shows up in graves, bone harpoons, and hooks. The Nile remained a source of protein, insurance against crop failure, and they were experimenting, trying new things, developing techniques that would become fundamental to later Egyptian civilization. Those cosmetic palettes found in graves, they weren't just for vanity. Grinding malachite into green eye paint served practical purposes. The copper compounds had antiseptic properties, protecting eyes from infection in the bright desert sun. This was practical chemistry. Trial and error over generations, learning which minerals could be safely applied to skin, which combinations produced the best results. They were also working with copper, not extensively, but enough to show they understood smelting. Copper pins, awls, small tools. This is metallurgy in its infancy, but it's there. Another technology that would become central to Egyptian civilization, beginning here in these small villages along the Upper Nile, and their pottery techniques, those would be passed down too. Later Egyptian potters never quite matched the quality of Badarian black-topped ware, but they tried. The tradition continued, the aesthetic preference for beautifully crafted vessels that became part of Egyptian culture. It started here. So did the burial practices, bodies positioned on the left side facing west, grave goods for the afterlife, the belief that death wasn't an ending but a transition to somewhere else, somewhere that required preparation. The entire Egyptian funerary tradition, everything that would eventually produce mummies and pyramids and elaborate tomb paintings, it has its roots in these simple Badarian graves, with their rippled pottery and shell beads. The Badarians lasted maybe 400 years, from roughly 4,400 to 4,000 BCE. Not a long time in the grand scheme of things, but in those 4 centuries they established the foundation for everything that came after. They proved that farming could work in the Nile Valley. They created the first settled villages. They developed craft traditions that would last millennia. They built trade networks connecting the Nile to the wider world. They were the first culture we can point to and say, there, that's recognizably Egyptian. Not fully Egyptian, not yet, but heading in that direction. The pieces were falling into place. Agriculture, permanent settlements, craft specialization, trade, social complexity, belief in the afterlife. But they were just the beginning. What came next would take all these Badarian innovations and amplify them, scale them up, transform them into something bigger, more complex, more powerful. The climate refugees who had fled to the Nile weren't just surviving anymore. They were building, creating new forms of society that would eventually astonish the world. The Naqada culture was coming, and they would change everything. By the time we reached the Naqada period, the Nile is no longer just a lifeline. It's becoming something else, a stage, a battlefield, a laboratory for power. Archaeologists divide this age into 3 phases, but the 2 that matter for our story are Naqada and Naqada II, roughly between 4,000 and 3,200 BCE. Don't worry about the exact dates. What matters is this. In just a few centuries, Egyptian society goes from scattered farming villages to something that is starting to look disturbingly familiar. Hierarchy, organized violence, rulers who are more than human, or at least say they are. The Badarian farmers had already broken the ice. domesticated animals, fine pottery, delicate jewelry. But if Badarian culture is the prologue, Naqada is where the plot takes off. This is the crucible where Egyptian civilization begins to crystallize into the form we recognize. No pyramids yet, no pharaohs, no written texts, but the DNA of all of that is here. Naqada, also called the Amrechen phase, doesn't announce itself with some huge monument. It creeps in through patterns you only see when you zoom out. Settlements become larger, burials become more unequal, and the Nile Valley starts to feel organized. Imagine you're walking along a low desert ridge above the floodplain around 3800 BCE. Below you, the river snakes through a strip of intense green. Fields of emmer wheat and barley, stands of date palms, cattle grazing in the flood recession. But what really stands out isn't the landscape, it's the village. This isn't a tiny cluster of huts anymore. Naqada. Sites like El Umra, Naqada itself, and others show compact planned areas with dozens, maybe hundreds of people living together. Storage pits for grain, specialized areas for pottery production, zones where they're working bone, stone, ivory. You're not looking at a random group of farmers anymore. You're looking at the early bones of a community with roles, with specialization, with inequality. You can see that inequality most starkly in the cemeteries. Earlier burials in the Nile Valley were relatively simple. Bodies in a flex position, a few pots, maybe a bead necklace if you were lucky. But as Naqada develops, some graves start to stand out. Larger pits, better construction, more grave goods. One person is buried with dozens of finely made pots, polished stone pallets, carved ivory combs. Another, not far away, gets 3 crude jars and a broken bead. Same community, very different afterlives. This is the archaeological fingerprint of an emerging elite class. They're not pharaohs, they probably don't call themselves kings, but they have more food, more labor, more beautiful objects buried with them than their neighbors. That difference didn't happen by accident. Some individuals are starting to matter more than others. And then there's the pottery. Naqada pottery is like a window into their heads, if you know how to read it. Before this, pots were mostly decorated with simple patterns. But in Naqada, something explodes. You start getting these remarkable red-on-buff painted vessels. Boats, animals, humans, strange symbols, all swirling around the curved surfaces of everyday containers. Picture one of these jars in your hands. The clay is buff-colored, the paint a dark red-brown. Along the body, a long boat stretches from one side to the other. Not a little canoe. A big crescent-shaped vessel with a high, curling prow and stern. On deck you see vertical lines that might be cabins or shrines. Above them, stick-like human figures stand with arms raised. What are they doing? Are they worshipping, celebrating, threatening? On other pots you see hunters with bows and arrows or throwing sticks, surrounded by desert animals, gazelles, ibex, maybe even lions. Sometimes the human figures look bigger than everything around them, towering over animals, boats, and smaller humans. That's not an accident. That's a visual hierarchy. Someone is more important, bigger, central. Some figures stand with their arms lifted in a posture that looks eerily like later depictions of kings and gods receiving offerings or smiting enemies. They're just stick figures now, but the pose will echo through Egyptian art for 3,000 years. We don't have captions. No one wrote, "This is Chief so-and-so, Lord of the River." But the imagery is already starting to separate out special people, special boats, special rituals. The idea that some humans stand closer to the divine than others is starting to take form in paint, long before it appears in stone, and then the pace quickens. Naqada II, also known as the Gerzian phase, doesn't feel like a gentle continuation. It feels like acceleration, expansion, tension. Settlements grow even larger and more complex. Some sites start to look like regional centers rather than just big villages. Places like Naqada and Hierakonpolis expand into what might be early towns, with distinct zones for craft production, animal enclosures, administrative storage, and ritual spaces. If you could see a map of Upper Egypt during Naqada II, it wouldn't just be little dots along the river. You'd see nodes, hubs, certain settlements acting as magnets, pulling people, goods, and power into their orbit. And wherever you get hubs, you get competition. The graves of Naqada II elites explode in richness, huge burial pits lined with mud brick, Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of pottery vessels. Exquisite stone vases carved from hard stone like basalt and diorite. Cosmetic palettes now shaped like animals. Turtles, fish, birds, and in luxury graves, palettes carved in elaborate shield-like forms. Some elites are buried with multiple bodies of animals, especially cattle. Others have human attendants buried nearby, possibly sacrificed or killed to follow their leader into death. It's grisly, but it sends a clear message. Some people are so important, their death is a crisis big enough to pull others into the grave with them. Power is no longer just economic, it's ritual, it's cosmic. And in the material culture, you start to see the shadow of something darker, organized violence. Weapons had always existed, of course. A hunting spear can be turned on a human easily enough. But in Nabta 2, the toolkit changes. You start seeing more and more polished stone mace heads, heavy stone balls or pear-shaped clubs, sometimes exquisitely made from hard stones. A mace isn't for hunting gazelles, it's for cracking skulls. By themselves, a few mace heads don't prove warfare, but they don't appear alone. Fortified settlements begin to show up, sites with ditches, walls, or palisades suggesting people are worried about attack. Some rock art panels in the desert show scenes of conflict. Boats facing boats, groups of warriors confronting each other, rows of bound or fallen figures. And the imagery on objects gets more aggressive. Some Nabta 2 pottery and carved ivories show bound captives, tiny human figures with arms tied behind their backs, sometimes under the feet of a larger figure or in front of a dominating boat. That icon, the bound enemy, will become one of the central motifs of pharaonic power. But here, it's just emerging, experimental, raw. Put all of this together, mace heads, fortifications, violent imagery, and you start to see the outline of something new in the Nile Valley. Not just local squabbles, but systematic conflict between powerful chiefdoms. This is the age when Upper Egypt likely fractures into a handful of competing regional powers, each led by a dominant lineage or clan. We don't know their names, but their signatures are in the graves they left behind. The biggest cemeteries with the richest tombs cluster around a few centers: Nabta, Abydos, Hierakonpolis. Each of these may represent a small proto-kingdom, ruled by chiefs whose authority comes from a potent mix of control over land, cattle, trade routes, and the ability to command warriors. These chiefs aren't yet pharaohs, but they're taking the first steps toward kingship. Their power is not just practical, it's symbolic. Their graves and their art shout that message into the future. And if you look closely at their symbols, you start seeing ghosts of the future too. On Nabta 2 pottery, palettes, and ivory tags, certain motifs begin to standardize. Birds with hooked beaks, coiled serpents, plants with distinct papyrus or reed shapes, unusual animals, falcons, desert creatures, perched atop standards or hovering over boats. These aren't fully formed hieroglyphs yet, but they're proto-symbols, visual shorthand for important concepts, names, or clans. Some of these exact shapes will later become hieroglyphic signs. The falcon, especially, will evolve into Horus, the god whose name every king will take. Even now, in Nabta 2, we see falcons perched above what may be towns or standards, marking control, ownership, or divine patronage. In some cases, you even see combinations of symbols repeated in the same arrangement, like the early flicker of a writing system trying to be born. Not just pictures, but patterns of pictures that mean specific things to the people who use them. Royal iconography, the visual language of kingship, is also starting to coalesce. The big figure dominating a scene, the ruler on a large boat flanked by attendants, powerful animals, lions, bulls, trampling or goring human enemies. These are prototypes of motifs that will later appear on royal palettes like the Nabta palette, but their roots go back to these Nabta 2 experiments. And here's where the story widens out beyond Egypt. Because Nabta 2 elites are not just looking up at the gods or sideways at their rivals, they're looking out beyond the Nile. In grave after grave, you start seeing things that do not belong to the Egyptian landscape. Tiny beads of deep blue lapis lazuli, stone that comes not from Egypt, not even from the Levant, but from far to the east, in what is now Afghanistan. Bitumen and other exotic materials that suggest contact with Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. You find imported pottery, or at least pottery imitating foreign styles. Even more intriguingly, you see Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals appearing in high-status Nabta 2 tombs. Cylinder seals are little carved stone rollers that produce a repeating image when rolled over wet clay. They were used in Mesopotamia to mark ownership, seal containers, and potentially sign documents. Seeing them in Naqada, two contexts, is like finding a foreign passport in an early chief's grave. Did Egyptian elites travel to the Levant and encounter Mesopotamian merchants? Did goods filter through multiple intermediaries, hopping from village to village along the coast and up through Sinai? Either way, ideas were moving with the objects. Some motifs on Naqada, two objects, rows of boats, complex processions, even certain annual combat scenes, may echo Mesopotamian art. This doesn't mean Egypt simply copied Mesopotamia. It means Egyptian elites were plugged into a broader late prehistoric world where chiefs and proto-kings from different regions were all experimenting with the same basic ingredients: trade, symbols, prestige, and violence. Long-distance trade wasn't just about pretty stones. It was about legitimacy. If you're an Naqada II chief trying to dominate your neighbors, what better way to advertise your status than to show off objects from lands your rivals have never even seen? Lapis beads shimmering in the desert sun, a cylinder seal with a mysterious foreign scene, exotic oils or resins in carved stone jars. These luxury goods become part of a political technology. The chief who can command caravans and riverboats, who can bring the faraway close, must be favored. By fate, by the ancestors, maybe by the gods themselves. By the end of Naqada II, all of these threads, inequality, trade, symbolic art, ritual power, organized violence, are tightly wound around each other. The Nile is no longer just a chain of villages. It's a patchwork of rising proto-kingdoms, each with its own elites, its own symbols, its own version of what it means to rule. The gods are becoming more distinct. The chiefs are becoming more ambitious. The weapons are becoming more deadly. And somewhere in that mix, the idea of a single ruler of all Egypt is beginning to take shape, not yet realized, but imagined. In the next phase, those imaginations will turn into action. One of these centers will outcompete the others. One lineage will learn to use ritual, trade, and organized war more effectively than its rivals. And the result will not just be a bigger chiefdom, it will be a kingdom. Before that happens, though, we need to step back from the politics and look at something even more fundamental: belief. Because in Naqada, Egypt, religion isn't just following along behind power, it's driving it. Religion doesn't suddenly appear when writing does. It doesn't wait politely for pyramids, priesthoods, and hieroglyphs. It creeps in much earlier, in the quietest, most intimate moments of human life and death. By the time people were farming along the Nile and herding cattle out in places like Nabta Playa, they were already doing something that goes way beyond basic survival. They were treating the dead differently, not just dumping bodies in convenient spots, not just leaving corpses where they fell. They were digging graves. They were arranging bodies. They were placing objects with them. That's our first real window into the minds of prehistoric Egyptians. Not their tools, not their houses, their burials. Archaeologists working in Upper Egypt, in cemeteries from the Badarian and Naqada periods, keep finding the same basic pattern. Bodies placed on their side, usually curled up in a fetal position. Often on the left side, often facing west. Why west? In later ancient Egyptian religion, the west is the land of the dead. The sun dies in the west every evening and is reborn in the east. West equals sunset, endings, the entrance to the underworld. We can't prove that Badarian or early Naqada people thought exactly like that. We don't have their words. But when you see hundreds of burials across different sites, all oriented roughly toward the setting sun, you're not looking at random habit. You're looking at a shared idea. And then there are the grave goods. People buried with fine pottery, stone pallets, jewelry made of shell, bone, ivory, and imported stones. Sometimes with meat offerings, as if stocking a pantry for the journey. Sometimes with personal items, combs, cosmetics, tools. This is not garbage disposal. This is investment. You're taking resources, time, craftsmanship, valuable materials, and putting them into a hole in the ground never to be used again. Why do that, unless you think the person in that grave somehow continues? That they still matter? That they might need food, beauty, protection in somewhere? This is the earliest hint of the belief that would one day dominate Egyptian civilization. Death is not the end. It's a crossing. And already, 1,000, 2,000 years before the first pharaoh, people along the Nile are acting like the crossing can be prepared for. But prehistoric religion wasn't just about the dead. It was also about animals. You've already seen hints of this at Nabta Playa, with cattle burials that are way too elaborate to be explained as simple waste. Great stone-lined pits, cattle skeletons placed carefully inside, sometimes whole animals, sometimes parts. That's not butchery. That's sacrifice. For pastoralists whose entire wealth, status, and daily life depended on their herds, killing a healthy animal and burying it is a huge statement. You're giving up what keeps you alive. Who or what do you give that to? Some researchers talk about a cattle cult, an early form of animal veneration that might be the distant ancestor of later Egyptian cow goddesses like Hathor, mistress of the West, lady of turquoise, patron of joy, music, sexuality, and the dead. In the earliest rock art of the Western Desert, we see gigantic cattle drawn much larger than humans, dominating the scene. That's not naturalistic art. That's symbolic art. Oversized animals, exaggerated horns, humans dwarfed beside them. It suggests an idea. Cattle are not just cattle. They're powerful, sacred, maybe even embodiments of some unseen force. Fertility of land, power of storms, the generosity of the sky that brings rain. Later Egyptians would imagine their gods with animal heads and human bodies. Horus the falcon, Set the strange composite beast, Hathor the cow. Those gods don't come out of nowhere. They grow out of millennia of living in intimate dependence on particular animals, watching them, fearing them, needing them, talking about them. Before there were gods with names, there were animals that felt more than animal. And then there are the figurines. Across prehistoric Egyptian cemeteries, especially from the Badarian and Nakatatharan periods, archaeologists keep finding small human figures, usually female, clay, bone, ivory, sometimes stylized, sometimes surprisingly detailed. Many have exaggerated hips, thighs, or breasts. Some have carefully incised hairstyles. Some are found broken, intentionally it seems, right before burial. Others are placed near the pelvis or chest of the deceased like companions. What were they? Fertility goddesses, symbols of the earth, the womb that produces crops, cattle, and children. Personal charms, the prehistoric version of a protective amulet, carried in life and then taken into death. Representations of specific ancestors, a way of keeping your grandmother, your maternal line close to you even in the grave. We don't know, and anyone who tells you they know for sure is guessing. What we can say is this. These figurines weren't toys tossed in at random. They show up again and again in burial contexts. They are shaped with care, sometimes painted, sometimes worn smooth from handling, as if they were repeatedly touched, held, maybe prayed to. In later dynastic Egypt, goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Nut would be invoked as mothers, protectors, and givers of life. Women would wear amulets of Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, or Bez, the dwarf protector, to keep childbirth safe. It's not hard to imagine that the roots of that whole symbolic universe run back to these small, silent figurines tucked into graves 5,000, 6,000 years earlier. The gods before the gods might not have had names, temples, or priests, but they may have had faces, little clay faces buried in the dark. Religion, even in its earliest forms, is not only personal, it has places. Nabta Playa, with its stone circles and cattle burials, is one of those places, a ritual landscape in the middle of what is now empty desert. Its stone alignments seem to track the summer solstice sunrise tied to the timing of monsoon rains. That's already a cosmic idea. Sky events linked to earthly survival. The sun tells you when the water will come. The stones remind you of the sun. Along the Nile Valley itself, in the pre-dynastic period, we start seeing other kinds of ritual spaces. Open-air shrines marked by wooden or stone posts. Enclosures where offerings, animal bones, broken pots, miniature vessels, pile up over time. Some sites in Upper Egypt show clear patterns. Same place, same kind of offerings, reused generation after generation. That's what a shrine looks like, long before anyone writes the word temple. At Hierakonpolis, which we'll explore later as a proto-city, there's evidence of what may be one of the oldest formal ritual precincts in Egypt. Animal burials that look ceremonial, baboon, hippopotamus, even elephants, carefully placed. Structures with layers of ashes and offering debris, spaces that weren't lived in, but visited. What happened there? Seasonal festivals tied to the flood? Initiation ceremonies? Animal cult rituals? We can't reconstruct the liturgy, but we can see the pattern. Specific places set aside from daily life, where groups gathered to do something repetitive, symbolic, emotionally charged. This is religion in its early architectural form, not yet stone temples but already sacred geography. And then, somewhere in all this, gods begin to localize. In the Nabta II period, certain towns start to stand out. Hierakonpolis, Nabta, Abydos. Later, in pharaonic times, these same places will be home to major gods. Horus at Hierakonpolis, Set at Nabta, the jackal god, eventually Anubis-like, at Abydos. Coincidence? Probably not. On ceremonial objects from late pre-dynastic Egypt, like decorated palettes and mace heads, we start seeing standards, poles topped with animal symbols, falcons, canids, strange desert creatures. Those aren't just clan logos. They're early divine emblems. You carry them into battle. You plant them in conquered towns. You carve them over prisoners. The falcon standard in particular is important. It appears again and again, perched over boats, over kings, over defeated enemies. Later, that falcon becomes Horus, the sky god, protector of kingship, represented as a falcon or a falcon-headed man. It suggests a deep continuity. Long before anyone wrote Horus in hieroglyphs, people in Upper Egypt were already rallying around a falcon symbol. Maybe they saw falcons as lords of the sky, precise killers, guardians hovering above. Set, the later god of chaos, storms, and desert, may have similar deep roots. The mysterious Set animal, long snout, squared ears, forked tail, doesn't match any real creature perfectly. But its earliest appearances in pre-dynastic iconography cluster in regions that would later be associated with Set worship. In other words, these weren't just animals. They were already being stretched into something else: local powers, protective forces, eventually gods. By the time Nama, or whoever you think unified Egypt, comes on the scene, the chess pieces are already on the board. Local cults, local emblems, local sacred animals. The pharaohs will weld them together into a national theology. But they inherit far more than they invent. If you strip away the later gods' names, temples, and hymns, what's left? A pattern, a way of thinking about the world. In later Egypt, that pattern crystallizes into a concept called Mayat: cosmic order, balance, truth, the right arrangement of things. The sun must rise, the Nile must flood, kings must rule justly, the dead must be buried correctly. If they aren't, the universe frays. We don't expect to find the word Mayat in a Badarian grave. But we can see earlier versions of the same obsession with order. Bodies all aligned a certain way, west-facing, fetal position, specific goods for men, for women, for children. Ritual sites reused in careful sequences, stone circles aligned to solstices, cattle killed and buried in formation. All of this says there is a right way to do things. The burial must follow the pattern. The offering must be in its place. The stones must match the sky. You don't act like this if you think the universe is random. You act like this if you think there are invisible rules, and that breaking them has consequences, if not now, then somewhere after. Cosmic order doesn't begin with priests reciting hymns in Karnak. It begins when a small group of early farmers decides that this side of the grave is different from that side, that the west is different from the east, that certain animals are more than meat, that certain days of the year are more than days. That's proto-Ma'at. The skeleton of an idea that will one day be dressed in myth and royal propaganda. There's one more layer to this prehistoric religion that's harder to talk about, but it's there, scratched into stone. Shamanism, altered states. Look at the rock art scattered across the eastern and western deserts. Long, winding lines of human figures, sometimes with elongated limbs, sometimes with animal heads. Scenes that don't look like normal hunting or herding. Figures floating, merging with animals, surrounded by dots and strange shapes. Some of these images are clearly practical: cattle, boats, hunters. But others look visionary. They match patterns seen in rock art from other parts of Africa and the world, where ethnographers have actually watched shamans paint what they see in trance states. Geometric patterns, part human, part animal beings, scenes of flight or transformation. In a context where survival is precarious and the environment is harsh and unpredictable, people everywhere seem to reach for ways to communicate with invisible forces. through drumming, dancing, fasting, chanting, plant intoxication. Prehistoric Egypt was no exception. We can't interview their shamans, but the clues are strong. Ritual sites far from settlements, up in hills or deep in the desert. Rock art placed in hard-to-reach spots. Repetitive motifs that look more like inner visions than outer reality. Later, Egyptians would develop an entire industry around guided journeys into the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, densely packed with spells to navigate a complex otherworld filled with gates, guardians, and transformations. Where does that come from? Probably not from nowhere. It likely grows out of very old practices where certain individuals, call them shamans, ritual experts, healers, claimed they could cross boundaries between waking and dream, between life and death, between human and animal, between village and desert. When you picture a later Egyptian priest reciting spells over a mummy, imagine the shadow behind him. An older figure, standing under desert stars painted in ochre and animal fat, chanting by firelight in front of a rock wall covered in strange half-human figures. The costumes change, the titles change, the temples get bigger, but the core desire is the same: to talk to whatever is on the other side. By the time pharaonic Egypt bursts into history with its pyramids, its state gods, its monumental inscriptions, the religious world of the Nile looks full-blown, complete, like it arrived fully formed. But it didn't. It was built, slowly, out of these prehistoric threads. Careful burials, oriented toward a meaningful horizon. Animal cults rooted in hunting and herding, turning real creatures into symbols. Mystery figurines tucked into graves, half goddess, half grandmother. Ritual sites in deserts and early towns, where people did things not because they were useful, but because they felt necessary. Local emblems: falcon, dog, strange beast, slowly evolving into Horus, Anubis, Set. A growing sense that the universe has an order, and that humans must play their part to keep it intact. And hovering at the edges, specialists who stepped out of ordinary consciousness and came back with stories about what lies beyond. All of that was already in place before the first pharaoh put on a crown. The kings didn't invent Egyptian religion from scratch. They climbed onto a platform that had been under construction for thousands of years. Hierakonpolis doesn't look like much today. A low rise of sand and broken pottery on the west bank of the Nile, some 600 kilometers south of Cairo. Wind, dust, and the occasional archaeological trench. You could drive past it in 10 minutes and never guess that 5,500 years ago, this was the most dangerous, most ambitious, most important place in all of Egypt. Back then it had another name, Nekhen, and if prehistoric Egypt had a capital, this was it. By the late pre-dynastic period, while most Nile villages were still clusters of huts along the floodplain, Hierakonpolis had already taken a different path. It was big. Not just for its time, big, period. Some estimates suggest maybe 5,000, maybe even 10,000 people living there before the official First Dynasty ever existed. That's not a village. That's a city-state. A human beehive of farmers, potters, brewers, priests, warriors, and rulers who were starting to look a lot like pharaohs, before the word pharaoh had even been invented. So what made this place explode while other settlements stayed small? Part of it was location. Hierakonpolis sat at a sweet spot along the Nile, fertile floodplains for agriculture, desert routes heading east to the Red Sea and west into the oases, and river access north and south. Whoever controlled Nekhen controlled trade, food, and people. In an age before writing, before pyramids, that kind of control didn't just happen. It had to be built piece by piece, decision by decision, over generations. And if you want to see how that process looked on the ground, you don't start with temples or palaces, you start with beer. On the edge of ancient Hierakonpolis, archaeologists found something no one expected: an industrial zone. Not just one kiln here and a half there, but a whole district devoted to mass production. You walk through this area in your mind, and the first thing that hits you is scale. Rows of huge vats sunk into the ground, blackened by fire. Layers of burnt grain, yeast residues, and calcified crusts that chemical analysis says were once beer. Not a little family brew for a village feast. We're talking industrial brewing. Some installations may have produced hundreds of liters in a single batch. Who needs that much beer? Answer: a city that's feeding laborers, hosting festivals, and binding people together with ritual feasts. Beer here isn't just a drink, it's social technology. Payment, hospitality, religious offering, political favor, all brewed in the same vats. Right beside the breweries, pottery workshops, everywhere you look, sherds. Thick-walled storage jars, fine red-polished bowls, decorated vessels with white-painted designs. Kilns built to fire consistent batches, standardized forms that show up not just here, but in other sites hundreds of kilometers away. That means these potters weren't just making for local use. They were manufacturers plugging into a regional economy. This is specialization. Some people grow grain, some shape clay, some brew, some manage. When you get that kind of task division, you're no longer talking about an egalitarian cluster of families. You're talking about a complex society with hierarchy, planning, and someone at the top coordinating the flow of resources. But the real story of power at Hierakonpolis isn't in the workshops, it's in the cemeteries. On a slight rise in the desert, away from the humming life of the city, lies an elite burial ground that predates the pyramids by centuries. Here, the dead weren't just buried. They were staged, large rectangular graves lined with mud brick, wooden roofs, sometimes reinforced. Bodies laid out with care, surrounded by fine grave goods, imported stone vessels, high-quality flint blades, beautiful ceramics, cosmetic palettes, jewelry of shell, copper, and precious stones that had traveled astonishing distances to end up in this hot, dry sand. One tomb in particular stands out, Tomb 100. At first glance, it looks like any other mud brick grave, but inside, on the plastered walls, archaeologists discovered something no one had ever seen from this early period. Paintings, faded, fragmentary, but still powerful. Boats with tall standards, figures holding maces, lines of bound prisoners, strange beasts, half real, half mythical. The scenes are chaotic at first sight, but patterns emerge. On one wall, a dominating figure smashes an enemy's head with a mace. Sound familiar? It should. That pose will become one of the most iconic images in Egyptian royal art. The king, as smiter of enemies. But here it appears centuries before the first-name kings we know. Around this central violence, there are boats that look ritual, almost ceremonial. Standards rising from their decks, perhaps marking clans, gods, or ruling houses. Some scholars see in these images the fusion of warfare and religious processions. Violence wrapped in ritual, conquest made sacred. Tomb 100 is often called the oldest painted tomb in Egypt. It's not just pretty decoration, it's propaganda. A prehistoric storyboard saying, "Here lies someone who commanded boats, led warriors, dominated enemies, and stood close to the gods." Whoever was buried there wasn't just rich, they were powerful in a new, more centralized way. And Tomb 100 is just one piece of a much larger elite zone. Across this cemetery, we see a steady escalation in status symbols, larger graves, more exotic goods, more elaborate architecture. It's like watching the birth of kingship in slow motion. At some point, leaders here stopped being just big men from important families. There began to be something else. Figures elevated above ordinary people, mediators between the human world and the divine, proto-pharaohs. But if you really want to feel how alien their world was, you have to look just next door, at another part of Hierakonpolis, the animal cemetery. Not scraps of food waste, not casual burials. These are deliberate, careful interments of some of the most dangerous and exotic animals in Africa. Elephants, hippos, crocodiles, baboons, wild cats, even a leopard. Some were buried alone, some alongside human elites, some in what looked like purpose-built animal tombs. Their skeletons show evidence of having lived in captivity, healed injuries, unusual wear on bones, conditions you don't get in wild animals. That means somebody in Hierakonpolis was capturing, keeping, and controlling apex animals, not for food, for symbolism. Imagine walking into a ritual precinct at Nekhen 5,300 years ago. There's music, incense, the smell of beer. Standards emblazoned with falcons or other totem animals wave above the crowd, and in an enclosure, chained or caged, an elephant, a live hippo, a snarling tamed wild cat. In a world where most people's biggest daily fear is a failed harvest, or a crocodile at the riverbank, what does it mean to see a ruler who keeps those terrors as pets? It means they have power, over nature, over chaos, maybe even over death itself. These animal burials hint at a cult of power that's both political and religious. The rulers of Hierakonpolis weren't just chiefs. They were beginning to cast themselves as god-kings in training, Humans who could negotiate with the forces that ordinary people could only fear. And this is where one of the most famous objects in Egyptian history enters the picture, the Nabta Playa. Technically, it wasn't found at Hierakonpolis itself, but in the temple precinct nearby. Still, it's intimately tied to Nekhun's rise. Carved from a single piece of siltstone, about 2 feet tall, the palace is a masterpiece of early royal art. On one side, a towering figure, larger than anyone around him, wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He grips a kneeling enemy by the hair and raises a mace to strike. Behind him, a small attendant carries his sandals because a king doesn't touch sacred ground with bare feet when performing a divine act of violence. In front of him stands a falcon, Pharaohs, perched above a set of papyrus plants representing the delta. A rope links the falcon to a human head emerging from the plants, as if the god himself is harnessing conquered land. Flip the palette. The same ruler now wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, processing in victory. Rows of decapitated enemies lie with their heads between their legs. Standards march forward. At the top, 2 long-necked beasts intertwine in a strange knot, controlled by handlers, maybe a metaphor for uniting 2 lands under one ruler. At the bottom, a mighty bull, often read as the king in animal form, tramples an enemy and batters down the wall of a fortress. This is not a neutral record. It's a boast, a claim. One man, one office, has united Upper and Lower Egypt by force and divine sanction. The king on the palette is usually identified as Nabta, possibly the same individual later remembered as Menes, the legendary first king of unified Egypt. Whether Nabta truly was the first, or just one of the last in a long line of unifiers, is still debated. But what's striking is where this artifact turned up, in the sacred precinct of Nekhun. That suggests that by the time Egypt was being stitched into one kingdom, Hierakonpolis was at the center of the story, maybe as Nabta's home base, maybe as the cult center that legitimized his power, maybe as the stronghold of Upper Egypt's warlords who had spent generations fighting their way north. Because the thing about unifying a land as long and diverse as Egypt is, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes centuries of conflict, alliances, and ideological groundwork. Hierakonpolis seems to have been doing that groundwork. From its industrial district, it produced the goods, beer, pottery, crafts, that fed and supplied a growing regional power structure. Its elite tombs and painted walls developed the visual language of kingship, smiting poses, processions, boats of the gods. Its animal burials turned raw, terrifying nature into a stage prop for royal ideology. And its temple became the place where rulers went to present themselves to the gods of the south, especially Horus, the falcon who would later become the patron deity of the living pharaoh. By the time Nabta and his peers were carving palettes and planning campaigns, the mental universe of Egypt was already primed. People along the Nile were used to the idea that some humans stood above others, that these elites had special access to divine power, that warfare could be sacred, that uniting territories under one ruler wasn't just practical, it was cosmically right. Hierakonpolis didn't invent all of that from nothing. It drew on earlier traditions from the Badarian and Nabta cultures, but it amplified them, concentrated them, and projected them outward with unprecedented force. Think of it as the launch pad. From Nekhun, rulers of Upper Egypt sent expeditions northward, trading, raiding, probing. Their pottery turns up in the delta. Their symbols appear far from their home base. Bit by bit, rival centers either aligned with this emerging southern power or were crushed by it. When the dust finally settled, and Egypt emerged as a single kingdom around 3100 BCE, the royal residence may have shifted north, first to places like Abydos, and then eventually to Memphis. But the ideological DNA of kingship, the smiting king, the Horus falcon, the god king who dominates nature and foreigners alike, had already been forged further south, in the furnaces, tombs, and animal pens of Hierakonpolis. The pyramids would come later, the great temples of Karnak and Luxor later still. But the blueprint for what it meant to rule Egypt as a divine monarch, that started here, in a dusty pre-dynastic city where potters, brewers, priests, hunters, and warlords unknowingly created the world the pharaohs would inherit. And that world, born in the mud-brick tombs and painted walls of Nekhun, was about to leap from regional power to something far bigger, the first unified territorial state in human history. The Nile Valley didn't wake up one morning, look around, and say, "You know what? Let's be a united kingdom today." By the time we reach the late pre-dynastic period, around 3300–3100 BCE, Egypt is already a patchwork of rival powers. Not villages, not simple tribes, real political machines. Along the river from the delta to Nubia, you've got what archaeologists call chiefdoms or proto-kingdoms. Think mini-states, dozens at first, then fewer but bigger. Each one built around a main town with surrounding villages, its own cemeteries, its own gods, its own elite families who control land, cattle, and trade. We know some of their centers by name now: Nakada, Abydos, Hierakonpolis in the south. In the north, powerful but still mysterious sites in the delta like Buto and Tel El Farka. These weren't just dots on a map, they were competing projects, different visions of what Egypt could be, long before anyone carved that word into stone. Over a few centuries the game changes. Small chiefdoms get swallowed by bigger ones, burial goods become richer for some elites and vanish for others. Trade routes shift. You can literally watch power consolidating in the graveyards. Fewer leaders, bigger tombs, more lavish offerings. The river's becoming a funnel channeling power into just a handful of regional heavyweights. And hovering in the background of all this, later Egyptian tradition whispers about something simpler. Not dozens of rival mini-states, just two. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Two lands, two crowns, two goddesses, two kingdoms destined to merge. So what's real here, and what's retroactive political propaganda? According to later texts, Egypt used to be split cleanly in half. Upper Egypt, the long, narrow stretch of Nile Valley to the south, symbolized by the white crown and the vulture goddess Nekhbet of Nekhen, Hierakonpolis. Lower Egypt, the broad, marshy delta to the north, symbolized by the red crown and the cobra goddess Wadjet of Buto. For 3,000 years, pharaohs would call themselves king of Upper and Lower Egypt, as if this was the original obvious duality built into the landscape. But archaeology paints a messier picture. Instead of one tidy southern kingdom and one tidy northern kingdom, we see multiple power centers in both regions. In Upper Egypt alone, Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos all look like serious contenders for regional supremacy at different times. In the delta, excavations show elite centers, warehouses, imported goods, signs of complex competing systems, not a single unified Lower Egypt, calmly waiting to be married off to the south. So where did the story of the two lands come from? Most likely, it's a later simplification. After unification, royal ideology cleans up the past. All those messy rivalries and shifting alliances and bloody transitions get flattened into a neat myth. Once there were two kingdoms, and then a great king united them. Order out of chaos in one royal body. It's a powerful story. It just isn't the whole story. Somewhere inside that myth, though, there's a kernel of history. Because as we get closer to 3100 BCE, the evidence from Upper Egypt starts to show something new. A line of aggressive, expansionist rulers who look a lot like the proto-pharaohs of a southern kingdom on the rise. One of them is so shadowy we don't even know his full name. We just call him the Scorpion King. No, not the CGI disaster, the real one. At a place called Abydos in Upper Egypt, archaeologists found a massive tomb from the very end of the pre-dynastic period. On stone mace heads and pottery tags, they found a sign that looks like a scorpion next to a royal-style symbol. That combination, name plus royal marker, looks very much like how later kings wrote their names. So whoever Scorpion was, he wasn't a village headman. He was a king. On one famous ceremonial mace head, he's shown wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, striking the ground with a hoe. Servants carry standards. Behind him, rows of bound captives and decapitated bodies. In front of him, irrigation canals, maybe newly dug fields. This isn't a quiet farming scene, it's conquest and reorganization dressed up as pious land development. Scorpion isn't just ruling, he's reshaping. He's not alone in this twilight zone before history. Other names flicker on the edges of the record. Erihor, Ka, maybe a Nama-like figure in an earlier phase. We don't know their full sequence. We don't even know how many of them there really were. But their tombs, especially at Abydos, are getting bigger, more complex, more royal. And their world is getting bloodier. If you look only at the later Egyptian king lists and myths, unification sounds almost peaceful. A destined king marries a northern princess, puts on the double crown, and boom, Two lands, one pharaoh, everyone's happy. The ground says otherwise. At multiple pre-dynastic and early dynastic sites, we find signs of serious violence, fortified settlements that show sudden burning and destruction, cemeteries with mass burials, young men, many with weapon injuries, skulls split by maces, bones pierced by spear and arrow. On decorated pallets and mace heads, a new visual language appears, the smiting scene. A giant, dominating king raises a mace over a kneeling enemy, ready to crush his skull. Above or behind him, symbols of gods watch approvingly. Below him, rows of decapitated foes, animals trampling bound prisoners, boats carrying severed heads as trophies. These images aren't subtle. They're political theater in stone. This is what kings do. They conquer, they kill, they bring order by force. Then there's Hierakonpolis, Nekhen, the powerhouse from earlier in the script. In its elite tombs, we see paintings of bound prisoners, marching processions, and boats packed with warriors. Some scholars think Hierakonpolis was one of the first to build a real regional kingdom in Upper Egypt, only later eclipsed by Abydos. If that's true, then the unification wars might have started as southern civil wars, with one Upper Egyptian node crushing the others before turning its attention north. So which was it? A slow political merger or a bloody military blitz? The answer is probably both. Over centuries, trade networks and marriage alliances are knitting the Nile communities together. Pottery styles spread. Religious symbols, like the falcon god Horus or the goddess Neith, show up far from their original homes. People are already thinking in larger units than just their own villages. At the same time, the archaeology screams conflict. You don't get burned towns and mass graves from polite economic competition. You get them from armies, or at least organized war bands, moving in, taking resources, and leaving destruction behind. Some researchers argue for a gradual stepwise unification. Upper Egypt slowly consolidates, absorbing one rival chiefdom after another, then exerts pressure on the north through trade and diplomacy, only occasionally resorting to force. Others see more of a big bang, a southern warlord, maybe Scorpion, maybe someone just after him, launches a series of campaigns into the delta, conquering key sites in a relatively short time. The evidence isn't clear enough yet to pick one definitive storyline, and that uncertainty matters, because it reminds us, this isn't destiny unfolding. It's human choices, gambles, and accidents piled on top of each other until they look inevitable in hindsight. But when we talk about the final act, the moment where myth and archaeology shake hands, we usually end up with one name, Nahma. You've probably seen his palette, even if you didn't know its name. It's one of the most famous objects in Egyptian history, a ceremonial stone about the size of a laptop lid, covered in intricate carvings. It's like a movie poster for unification. On one side, Nahma wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He towers over a kneeling enemy, arm raised, mace ready to fall, the classic smiting pose. Next to him, a falcon, probably the god Horus, tethers a human-headed papyrus plant symbolizing the subdued marshlands of the north. Translation: Upper Egypt's king, backed by Horus himself, dominates the delta. Flip the palette over. Now Nahma wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, strolling in procession, inspecting rows of decapitated bodies with neatly placed heads. The message is not ambiguous. Below, two fantastic animals with impossibly long necks are being tamed and intertwined by handlers. Many scholars think this is a visual metaphor for the two lands being yoked together into one. We also find Nahma's name on seal impressions and tags from Abydos, in a tomb complex that looks distinctly royal. At other sites, his Serak, the little palace facade with his name on top, pops up on pottery and goods, is clearly important. Later Egyptian tradition remembers someone very much like him, though usually under the name Menes, as the first king, the one who united Upper and Lower Egypt and founded the first dynasty. Did Nahma literally swing the last mace in the last battle of unification? We can't be sure. Some scholars think the process began decades before him and continued under his successors, but by his reign, something irreversible has happened. For the first time, we can talk about Egypt as a single political entity, ruled by a king whose authority, at least in theory, runs from the first cataract in the south to the sea in the north. What did that mean for the people living through it? If you were an elite in the winning camp, one of Nahma's allies, a high official, a priest in a favored temple. Unification was a windfall. New lands to administer, new trade to skim, new temples to endow. Your status leaps from local big man to national player. If you're an elite in a conquered chiefdom, things get more complicated. You might be co-opted into the new system, married into the victorious house, given a new title in exchange for loyalty. Or you might be sidelined, stripped of your power, your ancestral gods demoted in favor of the new royal cult. If you are a farmer, a potter, a boatman, your world changes more slowly, but it does change. Now, instead of paying tribute only to your local chief or temple, you're part of a much larger machine. There are standardized weights and measures, maybe standardized pottery forms. Officials show up counting grain, tallying cattle, marking jars with signs that say, "This lot belongs to the king." Those signs are the other quiet revolution happening at exactly this moment. Writing. In the last centuries of the pre-dynastic and the very start of the first dynasty, we start to see tiny labels attached to grave goods and storage jars, short inscriptions carved or inked on clay tags, little serics with royal names, lists of places, numbers. These aren't full sentences yet. They're not the rich, narrative hieroglyphic texts of later pyramids and temples, but they're something new, symbols systematically used to record information across time and space. This is how prehistory ends and history begins in Egypt, not with pyramids, but with labels. Writing isn't invented in a vacuum. It's a tool forged under pressure. The need to track taxes, rations, labor, offerings to gods, shipments of goods up and down 1,000 kilometers of river. Unification doesn't just create a bigger kingdom. It creates an information problem, and writing is the hack that solves it. For the first time, we can read, however faintly, the voices of the people who are doing the conquering and organizing: kings, officials, bureaucrats. The silent majority, the farmers, the weavers, the porters, the soldiers who died in those unification wars, remain mostly invisible, but their lives are now being shaped by institutions that will endure for millennia. The pharaonic court, the temple estate, the tax system, the idea that a single divine ruler embodies the unity of the two lands. By the time Nama and his immediate successors are finished, the Nile Valley is something it had never been before, a centralized, literate state. The small-scale experiments in hierarchy, religion, and warfare we saw at Naqada, at Nabta Playa, at Hierakonpolis, they've all been scaled up, systematized, locked into place under a crown that claims to rule by cosmic right. Prehistory doesn't disappear, it hardens into myth. The old local gods become gnomes and regional deities under a national pantheon. The old chiefs become vague ancestors. The messy, violent process of unification gets retold as a single heroic act by a single founding king. And from here on out, the Nile story is going to be written not just in bones and potsherds, but in carved stone, inked papyrus, and the monumental architecture of a civilization that has finally stepped, fully, into history. So now step back for a second and think about what we've just moved through. We started in a world that doesn't even look like Egypt in your mental map. Not a ribbon of green cutting through an endless desert, but an Africa where the Sahara was an Eden, lakes the size of small seas, rivers crossing what is now bare rock and sand, herds of animals migrating across savanna grasslands where today you'd die of thirst in a day or two. In that world, long before pyramids, long before pharaohs, long before anybody carved a single hieroglyph, people were already experimenting, hunting, herding, watching the stars, telling stories around fires we'll never see. Then the climate turned. The green Sahara died. The lakes shrank, then vanished. The savannas burned out and blew away. And across thousands of years, family by family, camp by camp, people were pushed toward one of the only places that still worked, the Nile. The river didn't turn them into Egyptians overnight. It wasn't some magical civilization switch. It was a grind. A long, messy, experimental process that took millennia. You had the early hunter-gatherers along the Nile banks, learning its moods, timing, the difference between a flood that feeds you and a flood that kills you. You had the cattle herders at Nabta Playa, dragging stones into circles in the desert, tracking the stars, building a ritual calendar in a place that would one day be nothing but sand and silence. Then came the Great Desiccation, the final brutal drying of the Sahara that slammed the door behind them. No going back to the Greenlands, no backup plan. The Nile or nothing. Out of that pressure, new cultures crystallized. The Badarian farmers coaxing grain from narrow floodplains, crafting some of the finest pottery in the ancient world, burying their dead carefully, with goods and beauty and probably hope. Then the Carter ended, sort of ramping everything up. Bigger villages, then proto-towns, then regional centers. Chiefs turning into kings in all but name, symbols of power, armed conflict, gods with recognizable faces and animal forms. Hierakonpolis rises, not as some cute little prehistoric village, but as a city that's already playing with the tools of state power. Temples, elite tombs, mass graves that look uncomfortably like prisoners of war, art that shows rulers smiting enemies and controlling wild animals, as if the whole world is something to be subdued. By the time we reach the first pharaohs, the Nabta Playa, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, you're looking at the end of a very long story, not the beginning of one. A story measured not in centuries, but in thousands of years. The pyramids are not a sudden miracle. They're a late chapter in a book that started with people camping beside seasonal lakes, in a green Sahara 8,000, 9,000 years earlier, maybe more. And almost everyone in that story is anonymous. We don't know the name of the person who first realized that if you built your house just a little higher, the Nile flood wouldn't wash it away. We don't know the woman who figured out that grinding and soaking certain seeds turned them into something edible instead of poisonous. We don't know who first noticed that the cattle started acting strange just before the rains, or who dragged the first stone into place at Nabta Playa and said, "Let's line it up with that star." We don't know the potter who perfected the Badarian red and black ware, the flint napper who could shape a knife so fine it looks machine-made, the Nacada artist who painted boats and standards and masked figures on a pot and, without meaning to, gave us our earliest glimpse of Egyptian religious imagery. But all of them mattered. Every tiny decision, every experiment, every seasonal camp and abandoned village, every child taught which plants to gather and which ones to avoid. Those are the foundation stones under the pyramids. The reason there's a Pharaoh Khufu at all is because there were thousands of years of forgotten people before him, quietly solving problems and passing on what worked. And the wild part is, we're still only seeing fragments. Every year, archaeology in Egypt and the Sahara pushes the timeline back or sideways. New prehistoric sites under modern fields, buried settlements in the desert revealed by satellite, stone circles and ancient shorelines emerging as the sand moves, fresh studies on old bones that suddenly show us diseases, diets, and migrations we had no idea about. The story of before the pharaohs is not finished. It's being edited in real time. 10 years from now, that neat, clean textbook line between prehistory and history in Egypt may look completely different. New radiocarbon dates might shift whole cultures earlier. New DNA work might link Nile farmers to Saharan herders in ways we only guessed at. We might find that what we're calling the first of something, the first stone monument, the first formal shrine, the first organized cemetery, is actually just the first one we've stumbled across. So next time you see a picture of the pyramids, or Karnak, or a golden mosque in a museum, try to layer this deeper story underneath it. Imagine the green Sahara behind it, the cattle camps, the stone circles in the desert, the tiny riverside villages built out of mud and reeds that vanished long before anyone carved in stone. Remember that pharaonic Egypt didn't appear on a blank canvas. It's the visible tip of a mountain of human trial and error, of memory and myth and slow accumulation. It's the legacy of the forgotten ones. If you enjoyed this journey into that deep, almost invisible past, it really helps the channel if you tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next dive into ancient history. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what part of prehistoric Egypt surprised you the most? If you want to go a step further and support the channel, you can also join as a YouTube member. That helps me spend more time on research-heavy episodes like this. But that's completely optional. The videos will stay free either way, and I'm just glad you're here. Because as long as we're still asking these questions, still digging, literally and figuratively, the echoes of those forgotten lives along the ancient Nile won't be entirely lost.